How's it going, guys? Vaibhav here, and one smartphone that's really made a lasting impression on me for 2020 out of the many that we've seen this year has to be the Vivo X50 Pro. Now, I made a full review of the smartphone over on GN Tech, so if you want to check that out, make sure you do that because the Vivo X50 Pro for the time was one of the better smartphones. It had a few flaws that became more evident once we started to see more smartphones come out in the later half of 2020, and that sort of made the smartphone a bit overpriced, a bit lacking in terms of feature set. But aside from that, the core functionality of the Vivo X50 Pro, whether that was the software, whether that was the performance, whether it was the camera, all of that was great. And now that we're hearing about the Vivo X60 Pro, it's only natural for me to cover what we know so far and have a look at how the Vivo X60 Pro is shaping up to be. Okay, so there's a number of different factors that I want to cover in this video with regards to the leaks we've seen of the X60 Pro, the display, the camera, and the design for the majority of the part. So let's start off with the actual design. I feel like the design is pretty much what's leaked the most on the internet, and I think this will give you a very good idea and a very good sense of the design. This is the X50 Pro. The X60 Pro looks pretty much identical to what the X50 Pro does. So in terms of design changes aesthetically, you're not going to see much. It's rumored that the phone is going to be the thinnest Vivo phone out there, and this was already pretty thin, pretty lightweight as well. So that's obviously a plus point for the Vivo X60 Pro. The next thing is, of course, the display. Now, the display on this particular variant was the AMOLED panel. It was a great, saturated, rich, and pretty much flawless AMOLED panel, if I do say so myself. Now, the Vivo X60 is not going to have a curved panel, but the X60 Pro is going to have a curved panel just like the X50 Pro you see right here. And I felt like the display was great. It's not going to be an under-screen camera, but it's going to have an under-display fingerprint scanner, so I think people can live with that. But pretty much, if you want to know how the display is going to look, it's going to look like this. It's a 6.56-inch AMOLED panel on the X60 Pro, and that about wraps it up for the display aside from one other thing. This was a 90Hz AMOLED panel, so it wasn't the highest refresh rate that you can get, but over the few months after the Vivo X50 Pro launched, we saw many smartphones ship with 120Hz displays that were cheaper in price but also delivered that performance. So this year with the X60 Pro, you're also getting a 120Hz refresh rate. Now, the display talk is a natural segue into the next portion of this video, which is going to discuss specifications as well as the overall performance of the smartphone. And this is where things start to get really interesting for the phone itself. Now, in terms of the software on the Vivo X50 Pro, you had FunTouch OS. It's not one of the most reputed skins out there, but after a few days of usage, you can kind of get used to it. And I did get used to it after a few weeks and a few months of using this thing. I used this thing for about 2 months when I had it, so I really enjoyed the experience. And I feel like what Vivo did by combining the hardware and the software really made sense from, this being a Pro phone, but not being that expensive of a Pro phone, if you get what I mean. So with the X60 Pro, you're going to get a completely different software, which is going to be Origin OS. Now, given the fact that Vivo is doing it, they have experience, they have the backing of FunTouch OS, they're probably going to make it more streamlined, and that's going to be what they call Origin OS. I think with this operating system, what they want to do is compete with the big guns, and it's going to ship with Android 11 if you were concerned about that. It's going to be the latest Android, and hopefully it'll get more updates, and even more updates than we saw with this smartphone. This smartphone actually got updates every month, so I was pretty impressed by this. So hopefully the Vivo X60 Pro can carry this forward. But the more interesting aspect about the Vivo X60 Pro has to be the processor. On the Vivo X50 Pro, you found the Snapdragon 765G processor, which was a 5G processor. It looks like the X60 Pro is going to have the latest Exynos 1080 processor. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Exynos processors are generally inferior than the Snapdragon one, so why did Vivo go for the Exynos one? Well, it looks like the Exynos ones this year, in particular the 1080, is going to be even more powerful, if not as powerful as the Qualcomm Snapdragon 888 processor. And mind you, this is not even the flagship processor for Exynos, so maybe Samsung does have something up its sleeve where its performance is going to rival the high-end Snapdragon processor and the even higher-end Exynos 2100, which is reserved for the Galaxy S21 series, is going to be even more powerful. So we've seen Antutu benchmarks of this thing, and it's going to have apparently a 693,000 score, which is just crazy to think of, considering just a few years ago we had like 100K as a score on Antutu. And secondly, it's gonna compete with both single and multi-core scores on Geekbench 5 compared to the Snapdragon 888 processor. So in terms of the actual power on the phone, you're gonna get a ton of power, whether that's PUBG on a high refresh rate or Fortnite or whatever you want to do when it comes to gaming on a smartphone. I think with the Exynos 1080, you're gonna get that sweet spot. It's a 5nm processor, and that's really gonna bring out the best of the smartphone. Now, again, I want to touch on one other thing about the Vivo X60 Pro here, which is the battery capacity. So it looks like the Vivo X60 Pro is only gonna have a 4130 mAh battery, which is actually smaller than the Vivo X50 Pro, which, if I remember, had a 4315 mAh battery. Don't quote me on that, but it is a bit smaller on the X60 Pro. And I feel like it's smaller because the processor on the X60 Pro is, of course, more power efficient, and that's why the overall battery capacity is smaller. And that's why maybe they were able to shrink the phone in terms of thickness, and everything just combines well together. Now, in terms of real world use, this thing gave me about 1.5 days of heavy usage. I don't know what the X60 Pro is gonna give, but it's definitely something to keep in mind for sure. Before completely moving on to the camera system though, I want to add one more thing. I think the charging speeds on the Vivo X60 Pro are pretty much going to be identical to the X50 Pro, if not maybe a slight increase. So this phone had a 33 watt charging capacity or charging speed, which basically meant 0 to 50% in about 30 minutes. I wasn't complaining with that. I think I can live with that. I don't know what Vivo is going for when it comes to marketing strategy. Are they going to include the charger in the box with the X60 Pro? That's something that I am not aware with, but I also want to touch on things this phone didn't have. So wireless charging was one of the notable absentees on this phone, IP68 certification was another, and stereo speakers, or the lack of, was a third. So if Vivo can somehow combine all of these three, or even just 2 out of these three, depending on the prioritization of a consumer. So I feel like IP68 should be there for sure, and wireless charging. This could be a very, very good smartphone competing with the likes of the Galaxy S20 FE, although the lack of stereo speakers is going to be annoying for sure as well. So I think Vivo has to combine all of these three things, because even if they miss out on one and they sort of aggressively price the X60 Pro, given the fact that it has a flagship camera system, it's not going to sell as much compared to the likes of the Galaxy S21 FE when it comes out, which surely will have stereo speakers, which surely will have a IP68 or whatever rating, and which will also have wireless charging. So this is something that Vivo really needs to consider when they launch the X60 Pro in 3 days. But with that being said, let's move on now to the camera. So the camera here was a primary 48 megapixel sensor. It looks like Vivo is retaining the same sensor. So the X50 Pro had a 48 megapixel primary camera, a 13 megapixel portrait camera, an 8 megapixel telephoto camera, and an 8 megapixel ultra wide angle camera. It looks like one of these things are going to get upgraded for sure. So the 48 megapixel camera is going to stay the same. It's going to be the main camera. It's going to have the same sensor even, but this time the aperture is going to be adjusted for better nighttime photography, and the glass that the camera system will use will be in partnership with Zeiss, which means better quality imaging. I don't know if you remember, but Nokia was one of the first ever companies to do so, so I'm really excited to see what Vivo can do with this sort of collaboration on their camera smartphone. The other complaint I had with the Vivo X50 Pro was the 8 megapixel ultra wide angle camera. They've bumped that up to 13 megapixels on the X60 Pro, but that aside, the gimbal system sees a major change. So according to Vivo, this is a second generation gimbal system. Now the gimbal system on the X50 Pro, it was good, it wasn't great. So when you compared it with the likes of the iPhone 11 Pro, for example, I don't think it stood a chance when it comes to videography. And I think Vivo still needs to work on that when it comes to stabilization maybe. And the overall quality of the sensor, there needs to be work put into the X60 Pro, and I'm hoping they've done it. But I think the imaging and the processing of the phone was actually really good. So for instance, the periscope camera, it actually managed to take some really good photos even in low light situations. So I feel like with the X60 Pro seeing upgrades to low light photography and seeing upgrades to the ultra wide angle camera lens, I think these are very, very smart upgrades on Vivo's front. So I'm really excited to see what the X60 Pro brings to the table. So that's about it for this video. The X60 series comes out in 3 days, or 2 days rather. The X60 Vanilla Edition, the X60 Pro, and the X60 Pro Plus. We've never seen the Pro Plus in this region, but if there's one thing that I want Vivo to do with the smartphone, it's everything that I've said in this video and make the pricing more affordable. So one of the biggest drawbacks of the X50 Pro was the pricing in this region in the UAE, and I feel like if they can tone down a bit when it comes to pricing, given the very competitive nature of the market these days, I think the Vivo X60 Pro or the Vivo X60 series in general could be a force to be reckoned with, which I think Vivo wants at the end of the day. So thanks for watching this video. This was Vaibhav, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.